Yeah.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're so happy to have you all here tonight. We will go ahead and get started. I know there's still a line for food. Take your time. I also know that there's been quite a bit of traffic outside, so some other folks might be trickling in. But just for the sake of time and respecting everyone's time here, we'll go ahead and get started with our event. My name is Narges Bajoghli. I am a associate professor here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I am an anthropologist and the head of the Middle East Studies, not a program anymore, Middle East Studies focus area at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And we have been leading both research and conversations in the academic as well as the policy world on economic sanctions for many years now. So this event is a part of a Nexus Award awarded by Johns Hopkins University specifically for this building. So for those of you who are new and visiting us at the Hopkins Bloomberg Center, welcome. This building opened a little bit over a year and a half ago. And in addition to housing the different programs and schools of Johns Hopkins University, including the one that I belong to, the School of Advanced International Studies, we are also a place that is really meant, because of our location, to bring together academic and policymakers to have conversations and to sort of broaden the scope of conversation. So the Nexus Awards, which is the sponsor of tonight's event, is an award given out to have convenings here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And the ones that we have been doing have been around the theme of can sanctions be reformed? And we've been having these conversations for a little bit over a year now. These convenings come on the heels of various research projects that we have done at Johns Hopkins SAIS. One of them around the impacts of economic sanctions, in particular across different countries in the Middle East, that has resulted in many research papers and books. And the second one that grew out of that, which will have a book forthcoming in 2026, hopefully, is about the impact of sanctions on countries around the globe. So that will be coming out as well. And these conversations were really meant to further take those kinds of findings that we've been having and to bring together policymakers, journalists, humanitarian workers from across the world who work in sanctioned countries to have conversations here with us about both those who are pro-sanctions, those who are anti-sanctions, those who are working on the grounds and understand the difficulties of doing humanitarian work in sanctioned countries, and to be having conversations about policy in particular around these issues. Tonight, we're really excited to be having a conversation about Syria and the sanctions on Syria, because in many ways, this is a very, very important case for can sanctions be lifted, and can they be done so in ways that really impact both the rebuilding of Syria as a country and for the benefit of the Syrian people. So in order to have this conversation, we're really honored to be welcoming the three speakers for tonight, one of whom unfortunately had his flight canceled last minute and so couldn't join us. So he will be joining us via Zoom. So on Zoom, we will have Ibrahim Al-Assil, who hopefully will be able to show us his face soon. He's a political scientist. Hi, Ibrahim. And he is also a graduate of Johns Hopkins SAIS. He is a research fellow at the Middle East Initiative at Harvard University and leads the Syria Project at the Atlantic Council. We also have Karam Shah to my far left, who's an economist who founded the Karam Shah Advisory Limited. He serves as a non-resident senior fellow at the New Lines Institute and a chief economic consultant at the Residence Coordinator's Office of the UN in Damascus. It's quite a handful. And then to my immediate left is Charles Lister, who's a senior fellow and the director of the Syria Initiative at the Middle East Institute, not very far from us, here in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on Syria, terrorism, and insurgency across the Levant. So to give you all a feel, I'm going to be moderating the discussion for the first hour between the three esteemed guests that we have. And then we have two mics on the aisles here, at which point about an hour into the event tonight, I'll ask folks who have questions to line up, and we'll do about 20 minutes or so of audience Q&A, and we'll sort of take it from there. So Karam, I actually wanted to start with you because I know that you've been spending a lot of time living in Syria since the change in the political sort of structure and the revolution of December into January of this past year. I wanted to know from you sort of what's the situation right now on the ground, and then also if you can help us sort of paint a picture of the sanctions landscape prior to all the changes that have happened. So what was the sanctions landscape like on Syria? And then we'll get into some of the changes that have been happening since.
So maybe I can start with the second part of your question. So Syria has been under a set of sanctions that is so comprehensive, it's kind of difficult to know where to begin from. So I'll take a chronological order. So starting in 1979, when the label of sponsor of terrorism, state sponsorship of terrorism was actually introduced, Syria was immediately on that list, and it stayed on it and continues to stay on it. So for the longest period, some other countries have been on and off on that list, like Sudan, for example, or Iran. Then in the early 2000s, there were also additional sanctions, including for Syria's role in Lebanon and also destabilizing Iraq, the Lebanon Accountability Act, I think. And then also in 2011, basically the sanctions exploded. So the use of sanctions as the main tool for leverage, for political leverage, and also accountability, we must add, started to be utilized not only by the US, but also by other countries. And the EU hopped on board as well and started imposing sanctions starting from May 2011. All of these sanctions, I think, need to be really distinguished from other countries in the sense that, first, we're not talking about UN-wide sanctions. These are all unilateral, unlike the case in, like, for example, North Korea. So that meant that Syria was still able to escape some of these sanctions through working with its patrons, basically, in other countries, mostly in Moscow, but also through Iran, which itself is also heavily sanctioned. Now, what happened following, but also in the UN, there's one point that also needs to be highlighted, which is while the country was not under sanctions and the Assad regime was not under sanctions, it's terrorist groups that were under sanctions and continue to be under the 1267 regime. That was not really sanctions on the country because these were non-state actors, but now you kind of wonder, well, is that really the sanctions on, like a set of sanctions on individuals or group or on the government? Because that group that is listed is now the government. So still the setup is, I think the most important thing is that these sanctions are not being implemented stringently, which is the key difference in sanctions really, because as you see this in Syria and in many other countries, there are cases where the legislation is there, but it's up to governments whether they want to enforce it or not to enforce it. So that's the situation in Syria. The most important piece of legislation in Syria with respect to sanctions is the Caesar Act, which was adopted in 2019. And basically what happened afterwards is really interesting, and I think you would agree with me as someone who has been researching sanctions also for a long time. The speed with which sanctions were being lifted has been mind-boggling. I mean, not in my wildest dreams did I think that sanctions could be lifted this quickly, you know? We're talking about, like, sanctions inherently are very difficult to lift, especially statutory sanctions. So labels like the state sponsorship of terrorism, after March 2003 in Iraq, they took 18 months to be lifted on a country that the US itself invaded, you know, so they were trying their best to help the country recover economically, like in part because of their self-interest, but still it took that long for it to be removed. In Syria, the speed has been spectacular. The Caesar Act is not lifted yet, but it looks like we're almost there. There are some technical stuff that we can also talk about. So that's with respect to sanctions. You can say now that EU sanctions, the UK and other countries like Switzerland, for instance, Norway have all but lifted their sanctions. In the US, all executive sanctions are practically gone. Statutory sanctions are still in place, but it looks like they're on their way of being lifted. So that's the topography of sanctions.
Ibrahim, I wanted to come to you next. So kind of given the landscape that Karam just laid out for us, and one of the things that he mentioned is that some of the new authorities in Syria have roots in organizations that sit on UN terror lists in some accounts. So what is the cleanest pathway to reconcile these UN listings with state-to-state dealings? Is it about role redefinitions? Is it about delisting petitions, entity restructuring? I mean, this seems to be a really interesting and sort of complicated case, especially when we're thinking about, we talk a lot about in our studies here on sanctions, the differences between targeted sanctions versus comprehensive sanctions. But when you have targeted sanctions for non-state actors or non-state organizations, especially as terror listings, and then now some of those organizations are a part of the ruling establishment, what is sort of the process like in this, and what are the obstacles and that you are observing and sort of seeing?
Thanks so much, Professor Narges. It's great to be with you. Great to be with you too, Charles and Karam and everyone in the room. I'm sorry that I couldn't make it. My flight kept getting delayed for a few hours, and then I gave up. These questions are very, very important questions that you just posed about the process and the obstacles that we're witnessing today. And a big part of this is because this is happening on this scale for the first time in the world. So we don't have another case that we can really compare and see how this should happen and what's the best way to lift all of sanctions in the fastest way to allow Syrians and Syria to move on. But today, the big, or there are two major issues here. There are the sanctions on Syria, as Karam was eloquently explaining. There are the sanctions on Syria, and many of them, they go back decades. So also removing them, they are not in one place. Nobody can actually make a decision on one day to remove all of them, because they've been there for a long time, and they've been there for so many different reasons on Syria. And then there is the other part is Hayat Tahrir Sham and Ahmed al-Shara, who they are sanctioned also separately from Syria as a state. So if Ahmed al-Shara wasn't in power today, things would have been different for Syrians, in a way that Syrians today have been helping Ahmed al-Shara to get off the list. But also at the same time, the government in Damascus and Ahmed al-Shara, they've been doing lots of the right things to get off the sanctions list, including, not to repeat, most of the mistakes and violations that were committed by the previous regime that led them and Syria to be on the sanctions list. Of course, we have the international sanctions and the American sanctions. President Trump was very clear about his intent and decision to remove sanctions, and many argue today that probably he does not know the effect of sanctions is still in place inside Syria, because not all sanctions have been removed. And then even after all sanctions are removed, we're gonna go also into a period or a phase where many of the businesses around the world will be hesitant to go to Syria. This is what somebody called sanctions hangover, that many will be witnessing, trying to understand if sanctions have been fully removed, and then to see if they will actually be maybe re-implemented again at some point. And then when the capital, when the businesses, when different investors trust that Syria is a place to invest, then they will go. So the obstacles, Professor, to go back to your point, the obstacles, part of them are legal and political, but also part of them that they are just related to the behavior of investors and different actors around the world, and in places like Syria, where sanctions have been imposed for so long that just a decision to lift them won't solve the problem. And that's something now practitioners and scholars are discussing and are learning when it comes to Syria, to see how even after full sanctions are removed, how can we bring back a country like Syria and an economy like the Syrian economy back to the global economy and to encourage investors to go back to Syria?
Yeah, that's a great point you bring up, Ibrahim, and one that I know has been circling around a lot in conversations about Syria and post-war investment and sanctions in particular. And, you know, the types of investment that Syria needs in order to rebuild itself after 15 plus years of civil war and many, many years of particular kinds of policies by the Assad regime that kept certain kinds of international businesses out. And then all of these years of sanctions that have really led to making the population poor in multiple kinds of ways, just like sanctions do. I wanted to turn to you, Charles, for a few things. One is to pick up on this line that Ibrahim is bringing up, which is that investment, large-scale investment, requires more than just the lifting of sanctions. It's a perceptions game, right? It's about, do investors see a particular state or a particular sector of the state as being stable enough for investment, as being someplace where they can put their money and it won't blow up in their faces in 6 months' time to a year's time. So how do you see this playing out in the Syrian system right now since January? And I know that the current Syrian president has been on a charm offensive for many months now and trying to sort of make the case that Syria is now open for business. I heard in a recent interview that Karam actually had, which I'll turn to you in a second, which you said that in some ways they're almost too pro-business and that they're open up for business super, super fast, and it's not taking into consideration some of the sort of more necessary political and social changes that need to happen, which we'll get to in a second. But for Charles, where do you sort of see this need for post-war investment, the hangover of the sanctions, the reality that you have a series of folks in government who have these terror listings by international institutions, and how that all sort of plays out right now in this really sort of messy soup?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, is this on? Messy soup?
I think we got that. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, sorry. Technology. Messy soup is a great description for all kinds of different perspectives that we might look at Syria through. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that right from the outset. It's always the first thing I say when I talk about Syria, which is we shouldn't be expecting anything to look anywhere near perfect in terms of implementing policies, in terms of development, in terms of reconstruction, in terms of ending sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. So I always think that's a really important sort of baseline to acknowledge right from the outset. You don't come out of 14 years of debilitating civil conflict, being a war zone in which multiple regional geopolitical states were, hammering themselves over Syrian soil and not just Syrians. And you don't come out of 53 years of brutal, corrupt, mismanaged dictatorship in a way that allows the kind of things you're describing to happen anytime soon. And that's even if sanctions are dropped in record speed, which so far they have been. And I mean, there is not only no case study out there that matches what we've seen, that even comes anywhere close to what we've seen. Mm-hmm. So how to answer your question? I mean, Syria, President al-Shara's buzzword these days is development. He puts the word development in an answer to almost everything that he might be asked. Clearly, that was the message, that was the image he wanted to be able to sell to Syrians on December the 8th and every single day since, to try to keep people on side, patient, not looking in other directions and other paths for a post-Assad Syria. One observation first to come to without sort of directly answering your question is, having just come back 3 weeks ago, one of the things that struck me the most was there is a huge gap of expectations. The government has done a superb job in selling the idea that it has signed dozens and dozens of MOUs, signed contracts, $15+ billion signed here, there, and everywhere over the last several months. And it's given an idea to the people, to the ordinary people on the street that, wow, things are going to start looking up for us pretty soon. And in almost every respect, with electricity perhaps being a slight exception, because we've seen some added hours of electricity in the last couple of months, there really is very little difference that people have felt on the street in terms of being able to put food on the table, find a job, and everything else. And the government hasn't done a good job at explaining that these things take an exceedingly long time to fix. And I increasingly think, including when it comes to the issue of sanctions, one of the things I heard from so many Syrians is, well, all of the sanctions are gone, so why are we not feeling the effect of that, in our paycheck or on our dinner table? And the reality is that there is so much more to play through as a process before they're going to feel any of those benefits. One of them is the perception of Syria having been under a wide regime of sanctions for so many years, but it's also more than just perceptions. The central bank governor is in town now for the World Bank meetings, but I was speaking to him in Damascus a few weeks ago, and he said, in most cases where an investor wants to basically make a significant processing of finance into Syria, he still has to get on the phone to banks and processing entities in order to essentially give them the confidence to process the transaction. So the SWIFT system's been turned on so they can transact and money can go into Syria, but the infrastructure that just allows you to transact and to receive is still on its knees. Baby steps. The bank is still working very close. The central bank is still working very closely with the French central bank, with the IMF, with the World Bank, to try to figure out how they can speed through all the necessary reforms that will also give foreign financial entities the confidence to interact with a more robust, more mature economy. So it's not just about the sanctions being lifted, which I think we're all agreeing on. And then beyond that, coming to Ibrahim's point to close out, I think the government itself does also need to continue to try to send the right messages and to continue to do the right things. And clearly there have been missteps along the road. Coming back to my original message, the first thing I said is we shouldn't be expecting everything to be perfect, but they have made mistakes. The violence in Sweden in July was clearly a moment at which some actors around the world, government, corporate, and otherwise, blinked a little bit and thought whether or not now really was the right time to see Syria as an investment opportunity. And that too is going to take a long time to get past. Syria is not a stable place these days. The rate of violence on average has very slowly declined over the last 10 months, but still anywhere between 20 and 40 people are being killed every week. So it's still an unstable environment. And so again, if you're an investor who has risk teams and analysts who will be providing regular briefings on Syria, they will be saying exactly what I just said. And if you're an investor, you're probably still thinking, well, is it the right time? Do I need those levels of violence to look much, much lower? So again, sanctions is really important, but there is a much wider set of kind of considerations to take into account.
Yeah, and that reminds me of Kerem, when you had said recently that lifting sanctions is necessary, but it's insufficient for recovery, which sort of echoes what Charles has just mentioned. So I have two questions in here. One is banking versus black markets. So when central banks and the banking sector has been sanctioned for so long, like it has in Syria, that creates opaque parallel markets. This is one of the reasons you have, for example, in the case of Syria, the Copticon, the drug sort of deals. In other countries, it's dealt with differently, but essentially part of what sanctions are really successful at doing is creating black and gray markets for states, and especially for regimes and military establishments, because it's not like they're going to put their hands up and say, oh, we're sorry we made you mad. We're going to come and surrender or come to the table with you. Instead, they're going to create black and gray markets to continue to have the flow of capital come in and out of their countries. So in this banking versus black markets, what is a workable compliance blueprint today for banks to re-enter Syria without over de-risking themselves? Transaction corridors, utilities, public comfort letters, things like that. And along the same lines, when you mentioned that sanctions lifting is necessary but insufficient, what are some of the preconditions that you'd prioritize moving forward towards sort of moving the macro needle on sanctions, especially because you work so much in the development sort of humanitarian world and advising folks in that world?
mean, I was opposed to the imposition of sanctions on the banking sector in Syria from the get-go. And the main reason why I'm opposed to it is that they're just so counterproductive. What you do is you basically push all actors from avenues where you do have some visibility. These are the legal avenues for payments, into a space that is just so opaque, you really have no visibility whatsoever. So how is that really helpful to the country? Imposing sanctions is beyond me. And that's only the first layer, you know, the initial impact. It's much more complicated than that. If you actually target the banking sector of a country, you also, for example, reduce the incentive for updating your compliance standards as a bank. What do I care if I can't really process international transactions to begin with? So I'm not gonna do it the way I should be doing it, because the banking sector is just so isolated, it's not worth it. You know, there's no point in keeping up these compliance standards. So you practically push everyone into the Hawala system. And believe it or not, actually, this is where autocratic regimes thrive. They would love to be pushed into that direction. They would love for all transactions to happen through such a black box, because that's where they can coerce the recipients of money, or it becomes easier for them to coerce them. That's how they can siphon off some of the money. That's how they've been doing it through multiple international and humanitarian actors, by imposing an exchange rate that is so much lower than what's offered in the black market, because these humanitarian actors cannot but to use the banking sector, the formal banking sector. And one thing to also highlight is that the banking sector has not been really completely cut off. So there were at least 2 banks that continued to process transactions throughout the conflict through SWIFT, you know. It's just that it was extremely cumbersome for them to operate. With that in mind, then what can we do going forward? I think we need to appreciate the multifaceted nature of the situation. You know, the challenges are just so complex. I believe you need to have an approach that is both top-down and bottom-up. What I mean is, top-down, as in you need to focus on the regulatory framework. You need to work with the Central Bank of Syria, for example, and try to remove them from the Financial Action Task Force list, the gray list, you know, where the entire system is viewed as being opaque. The Syrian government can, and this is, to be honest, primarily on the Syrian government. I mean, they are the key actor there, and they're receiving more than enough support, you know, from international institutions. They're actually receiving more support than they could handle, you know, the central bank specifically. And in there, you can talk about modernizing their regulations, for example. They can talk about pushing private banks to comply with like Basel III standards and so on as a requirement for being able to operate, and so on and so forth. Now, the bottom-up approach, I think, should also operate in tandem. We cannot take a sequential approach. The bottom-up approach is, look, I know that the majority of banks in Syria have headquarters abroad, have parent banks abroad, you know, be it for the Bajoghli in Bahrain, or for QNB in Qatar, or for 2 banks in Jordan and in Lebanon. So you can still work with these banks, focusing on the relationship with their parents, do have very good standards, and like they've been so far operational, and trying to bring their Syrian branches up to speed so they can engage. And this is something that we've been doing, by the way, at our advisory. We went through a systemic review of all 15 banks, identified 4 of them, and we're now trying to match them with banks, at least in Europe, at this stage. So that's with respect to the banking sector. Did I answer your question?
I think so, yeah. Thank you. Ibrahim, I want to come to you now. Since you work so much on diplomacy and regional alignments, I want to ask you about the regional choreography going on right now with Syria, Saudi, the Emirates, Qatar, Turkey, how they're sequencing recognition, investments, and security files And then I want to also ask you after that, I'll just tease it for now, but we can get into this after your answer to that first question, which is the potential differences between what Israel wants for Syria and what Arab countries that I just mentioned, Saudi, UAE, Qatar, Turkey, want as far as sanctions relief and the rebuilding of Syria is concerned, and how those things either play against each other or in conflict with one another, and what that's going to mean.
That's an excellent question, and they're actually very much related, because when you were asking the first part, I was writing down some points, and I wrote Israel and Iran as well, the Islamic regime of Iran. I think the fall of Assad was a major positive event in the region. We're talking about a country and an actor that for decades used to just blackmail the region and try to use different ways of coercion or plots to play different parts against each other, and to engage in a very destructive way of regional diplomacy. That doesn't mean everyone else were greats and angels, not at all. But we're talking about the Assad regime that ruled Syria. With the collapse of the regime, it made an opening for many different issues in the region. They are related to economy and related to sanctions and related to political economy. Of course, Syria is almost in the middle of the Middle East, and many countries couldn't afford having Syria as a black hole over the last 15 years. And that's why we saw different actors in the region moving towards Assad over the last 4 to 5 years, trying to reach some compromises or some agreements to bring Assad back to the Arab fold, which many of us, and I very much thought it was a wrong step, but I also understand why. Many of them, they're like, we can't afford to have that part of the region off the grid. First, it affects the political economy with Captagon and all the drugs dealing. Add to that the refugees coming out of the country because of the war, but also because of the economic situation and sanctions inside Syria. And the collapse of the Assad regime made an opening for that. However, of course, not every actor in the region saw it that way. And certainly it was an interesting point of convergence between the Islamic regime of Iran and the Israeli government, that they both saw it's in their interests to keep Damascus weak and to keep Syria fragmented. And that's the public policy of Israel. It's not a secret that it wants to keep Syria weak, fragmented, and poor. And of course, there have been lots of effort to keep sanctions on Syria for that regard. For Turkey and the Arab states, of course, it was totally different, and to Jordan as well, because lifting sanctions on Syria is instrumental for their economic plans. When we talk about 2030 in Saudi Arabia and other diversification plans in the Gulf for Qatar and the UAE, and the economy, the Jordanian economy and the Lebanese economy, and of course the prospects of many of the Turkish companies, all of that is very important for them, because Syria, while it doesn't have natural resources, it has that locations that it allows it in its political economy to be to integrate in the region and to allow and to make lots of money out of transit between Turkey and Europe from one side, and Saudi Arabia and the Arab depth from the other side, and also, of course, to the East Mediterranean. And finally, here on Israel and the prospects of the relationship, because Israel, of course, it's one of the closest allies to the United States in the region, and where Israel stands could affect what policy the United States pursues now and in the future. At this point, we see differences between the priorities of the United States and the priorities of Israel when it comes to reintegrating Syria and to open up to the government and to lifting sanctions. But I think things are going in a more constructive direction. And now with what's happening at the deal in Gaza, if that works, that could actually make space for the Israeli policy to evolve in a different way and at least allow Syria, if not to be part of it, but allow Syria to be reintegrated in the region. And I think that a major point when we talk about the regional order, and the Middle East is a region without regionalism. We don't have any regional order or regional institution or organization in the region. Having Syria back to the economic regional order is very important for the prospect of a constructive regional order.
Wonderful, thank you. Charles, I want to turn to you, since I know you've both written and talked a lot about the Copticon economy. So first, I would love for you to give sort of an overview of what that is for folks who may not know. But then, you know, with, for example, the US war in Afghanistan, there was a big pressure put on doing away with the development of, and the agricultural development of poppy seeds. But then during the US occupation of Afghanistan, heroin was a huge export because farmers on the ground don't necessarily care what the policy experts at the top are saying. They need to make money, plus there are markets, drugs and weaponry being one of the biggest sort of fuelers of our world economy. So Copticon was something that the Assad regime turned to as one of the ways to bypass sanctions, and by I don't mean bypass, but sort of bring in money despite sanctions. What do you think about an narco state sort of relapse as a legitimate revenue returns, especially if investment takes a long time to take place? Going back to your comments from earlier about Syrians just being like, okay, well, the sanctions are gone, why is my life not better? And then there already being embedded ways of trade to be happening, even if it's on the black market.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it gives me about 15 different ideas of things to say. So let's see if I can try and make it cohesive. I mean, the first thing to say is, I don't think we yet have any direct evidence that Bashar al-Assad was sat in the presidential palace directing the Copticon trade. It was more of an organic thing that came out of, and Karam's done work on this too. I think you can trace back when it started to pick up, and then when it surged, was around about the time, first, yes, the Caesar Act came in, but also the fiscal collapse next door in Lebanon that had a profound effect on the Syrian economy. And this first thing I'm going to say is maybe slight divergence directly from your question, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about in retrospect now, that the Copticon trade, as it developed from 2019 into the early 2020s, came about because of those two events, or at least in part because of those two events and the effect that it had on the economy and the ability of traditional elites around Bashar to make money through semi-legitimate and often more legitimate means. And they were able to enrich themselves through loyalty to Bashar. And that became much more difficult, especially after the access to the US dollar became much more restricted because of what happened in Lebanon. And I think there is at least an indirect correlation you can draw between the surge in the Copticon trade as a result of those two things, sanctions and what happened in Lebanon, and what was never tested until the end of November last year, which was the extent to which that very wide and broad spectrum of so-called loyalists around the regime, and I'm not just talking about the upper elite, but as it trickled down to who controlled checkpoints, who had any kind of a role in security, in the economic elite, the extent to which they still saw Bashar al-Assad as the key to their continued, not just survival, but economic enrichment. And I think the drugs trade and the Copticon trade and the extent to which it took over everything in terms of control of roads, control of checkpoints, where different military units were based around the country in order to be able to control and benefit from the drugs trade, had, I think, a really profound effect on the extent to which the regime and its various soldiers and security officers were able to and willing to fight when they were challenged 5 years later for the first real time on November the 27th last year. So I think it's a really interesting test case, which is difficult to scientifically test, but it would be interesting to see work done on the extent to which that really did determine the fact that the regime just collapsed the moment it was seriously challenged. But on the trade itself, I mean, first of all, we're not going to see a return to what we saw under Assad, where significant parts of the state were either turning a blind eye to, if not directly facilitating, a nationwide drugs trade. That's not going to happen. Captagon was one of the most, in its latter phases, one of the most potent symbols of the regime. And being an armed group that came out of the right-hand side of the armed group spectrum, there is no way that Ahmed al-Shara is going to allow, let alone support, the idea that the state has some kind of a role to play in the Captagon trade. It is essentially like saying we're no different to Bashar. So I don't see a return to that model. I had a 3-hour meeting with the Interior Minister a few weeks ago, and the Interior Ministry is basically the primary body responsible now for countering narcotics in Syria. And he said, and we can debate whether or not maybe this is a slight exaggeration, but he said the first phase of his response as from the Interior Ministry to the drugs trade was to tackle production facilities. And he said, that's now complete, we're now in phase 2, and we're dealing with storage. And so you get incidents almost every day now where they're digging them up in fields, they're finding them hidden in walls and in big vehicles. So his claim is we've defeated the production, and now we're turning to the vast stocks that had been stored and prepared for smuggling, in the months and years to come. So I think, again, like I say, we can debate the extent to which that clear line has been drawn. There may still be small-scale production going on. Definitely, it is not a state policy to allow that. They are very clearly and stridently against. And coming to an extent to the question you asked, Ibrahim, the Interior Ministry's anti-narcotics forces only exist because the Saudi and the Qatari government have funded their establishment and their training in the Gulf, and the provision of assistance and everything else they need to run that unit across the country. So clearly the Gulf has learned the lessons from what hurt them the most in more recent years, and they've channeled a lot of their support in the security sector to counter it. But it is going to be a long challenge. As I say, there's still drug busts going on almost daily. The only other thing I would say here is 30% roughly of Syria is not under the government's control. And so those are, gray areas are where there is still some challenge. And in Sweden, after the violence that happened in July, the rate of Captagon smuggling from Sweden into Jordan or towards Jordan has risen by more than 400%. So since a very broad spectrum of Druze militias took control of that governorate, we have seen an explosion in Captagon smuggling across the Jordanian border. And so there are clear correlations between governed and ungoverned spaces here in a post-Assad Syria. And we do have a government that is very determined for symbolic as well as moral reasons to fight the drugs trade. But there's still a third of the country that have other more important priorities right now, which is basically facing off with the government, consolidating their own control and seeing where their future lies. And in those spaces, drugs trade, I think, is probably still prospering more than it's suffering.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I'd like to ask another round of questions, and then I'll open it up to the audience to ask their questions. So be thinking about the kinds of questions you want to ask our stellar panel. Karam, I want to come to you. So, in Syria under sanctions, just like in many, many sanctioned countries, when people don't have enough or when things are going wrong, they tend to say, yes, the sanctions are impacting us, but really it's the mismanagement of the government, right? We hear this over and over, whether it's in Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Syria, under Assad, whatever it might be. So there's an attribution challenge both to sanctions, but I would also venture to say to post-sanctions states as well, where during the war itself, you cautioned about how hard it is to disentangle conflict, misgovernance, and sanctions effects. But in a post-Assad setting, especially given what all of you have said just now about how long it will take, you also have, just like in many spaces where there is a regime change, you have a group of folks who don't have a ton of experience leading a national economy, leading a nation state, coming into power. So there's obviously going to be trial and error in figuring a lot of that out. But in a post-Assad setting, what metrics will let us attribute improvements or failures to sanctions relief versus policy choices by the new authorities?
That's the most difficult question, I would say. You know, I mean, methodologically, if you want to try to do that identification strategy, you know, from an economic perspective, it's much easier for a policy researcher or a politician to make claims than an academic. You know, it's quite difficult for you to establish a causal relationship between sanctions and whatever else you're looking at, really, because of numerous challenges. You know, I mean, like reverse causality stemming from data quality, from endogeneity, and so on. I mean, it's a question I wouldn't attempt to try to answer, honestly. I think it's plausible for us to believe that sanctions do affect the state capacity in so many ways because of some theoretical arguments that we know for a fact are correct. You know, so for example, when the EU imposed sanctions on Syria's oil exports, over 90% of that oil used to go to the EU. And that was the source of funding for nearly a third of state revenue. You know, if you take the average over the last 5 years of the Assad regime. Now, that money used to go also, at least in part, to state institutions. So that's how you pay staff salaries. And because of sanctions and other factors, Syria continues to struggle to export its oil. Not that it has enough excess, but it's still quite difficult, you know, to in fact even reconstruct the sector. So yes, of course, that does affect the state capacity to first cope with the conflict and then deal with the consequences of the conflict after it's over. It's a very difficult relationship to establish. But again, I would say, like at the moment, the key challenge that Syria faces is indeed economic decay. You know, that the fact that state institutions have been hollowed out, you know, you cannot get a functioning state sector where a PhD holder who is a lecturer at a university, state university, is paid less than $100 per month, you know. The ones that manage to flee, they manage to flee on average because they were more qualified, and you're left with the ones who really are on average less qualified. Again, on average, I wouldn't make this sweeping argument. Some people stay behind for their parents, for example. So it's, I mean, I think now with sanctions being out of the way, more or less, and I think the Caesar Act, especially with the development that happened with the Senate passing like the NDAA back to Congress, it looks like the Caesar Act is more likely to be lifted than not. I think we would start thinking about sanctions and start focusing more on sanctions hangover. And that field of research, I just feel is, I think it's much more interesting than the study of sanctions. You know, it's also under-researched. You would know this better than I. What is because of sanctions and what's because of other things, yes, is difficult to establish, but we have now much bigger fish to fry, you know, than sanctions being, like lifting them as a necessary but insufficient condition for recovery.
Great, thank you. Ibrahim, I'm coming to you with a question now. I don't know if you can actually see us. So one of the things, so in addition to studying sanctions, I study a lot on discourse. And one of the discourses that sort of swims around Syria a lot from different sectors is this idea of sort of what does a post-Assad Syria look like, especially given that Syria itself is such an incredibly pluralistic and diverse society. And so thinking about sort of inclusive governance in this post-Assad Syria, what are some of the minimum political steps in your suggestion and your ideas, such as local council, detainee files, missing persons mechanisms, that would convince skeptics that sanctions relief isn't just about enabling authoritarian retrenchment under a new flag, but it really is about sort of moving Syria forward in the ways that many of the folks who fought for a free Syria are attempting or did attempt to do.
Thanks, Narges. And yes, I can see you, the three of you.
Okay.
And this question, you know, these type of regimes, when they fall, they really don't fall until they deplete those societies. And when we say post-Assad Syria, it's really not post-Assad yet. And I do want to highlight this point, that the effects, the damage that the Assad regime and the tyranny of 54 years that was inflicted on Syria, all those effects are still there. The hollow public institutions, the misgovernance, the corruption, what one senior official in Damascus called it, the strategic incompetency in the public sector, where people, they usually go to work, they just want to survive. They don't want to shine so much because they are afraid then probably they will be fired. You're under tyranny, you are not encouraged to shine, and then you don't want to seem irrelevant at all, which, by the way, echoes a little bit in Washington, D.C. these days, unfortunately, and the public sector. But really to see the long-term effects of these issues, what could work, and Charles alluded to this very important point about what's left there and what this government is trying to do. I think for them to be able to move, and for long term, I would echo again what Charles said, that things not only won't be perfect, they're not going to be normal for any time soon. The country is devastated. Assad really tore apart the Syrian social fabric. But some steps for power sharing and rule of law are necessary. There is no way for Syria to move ahead if not every day is better than the day before, even with a very small measurement, but at least to see that the current authority is trying to open up, is trying to avoid violence. When we talk about the Kurds, also the Druze and everyone else, all these conflicts, to actually prioritize compromises and negotiations and agreements over clashes, that's a good indicator. And the rule of law, because that's what investors care about. They don't care about democracy. They care about if they go and they put money and there is a problem, if there is a judiciary that could actually guarantee their investments. And if there isn't a rule of law, we're just recreating the same cycle of, and I will conclude with this point, of misgovernance again. Because even sanctions are part of misgovernance. For a governor, not make sure you don't get on a sanctions list. That's something leaders owe their populations. So when country is sanctioned, especially for the reasons that Syria was sanctioned for, that's another violations of the right of the Syrian people by those governments. And today, the major responsibility of this government is to take Syria off the sanctions list, especially that big part of it, as I said in the beginning, is because of who is in power today. They need to get Syria off the sanctions list and then rehabilitate it, power sharing, and rule of law.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. Charles, for my last question with you, since you focus so much on security, I wanted to talk about the border security and the neighboring countries. You mentioned a little bit of this in your previous answer as well. Which cross-border security compacts, whether with Iraq, Jordan, or Turkey, are prerequisites in your view for donor confidence and investment confidence? You can also pick up a little bit on what Ibrahim and Kerem were saying as far as the governance issue, and especially around rule of law when it comes to investment. But I would also really love your thoughts on border security itself with neighboring nations. And because one of the thoughts is that, companies that are both either from the region or have a long history of investments in the region will also be potential investors in Syria. And so how does that play into this?
Yeah. Start by saying, or maybe reiterating a point I made in a slightly different way earlier, which is that businesses, in my experience at least, are extremely risk averse when it comes to security issues. Mm-hmm. And so even when Syria is in a place when it starts to look more secure, more stable, whether you're looking at the border or interior situations, many businesses will still say that's not enough. It needs to have been very stable for a long period of time before I'm in a position to invest. And that's before you take into consideration that Syria still has all the ingredients for collapsing back into conflict. So That's the first kind of, again, the kind of baseline point to make is it's not just about putting all the pieces to secure the country in place. It's not just about security sector reform and having an effective interior ministry that can do some of these things, but it is about proving that that's sustainable and then showing the effects themselves are sustained. And again, coming back to that original point that all of this is going to take a long time. But on border security in particular, I don't think we can single out any particular country borderline that is more important than the other for the reason that I just gave, which is investors aren't going to say, I'm interested in, construction in Damascus, but I need only the Turkish border to be secure. They're going to want the whole country and all of its borders to be in a secure place. And that then puts the onus more on geopolitics than it does on anything else. And for that reason, Syria has certainly better relationships with Turkey and Jordan than it does with Iraq and Lebanon, looking at the things from north and south and east and west. There's been progress on the Iraqi side, but it's complicated. With the state itself, there is much stronger confidence than where we were 3 months ago on the border security issue when you have Syrian forces on the Syrian side and Iraqi border forces on the Iraqi side. Things are very stable and settled. As we saw most recently, maybe 4 or 5 days ago, when there's news that a Hashd Shabi force is driving towards the Syrian border, all of a sudden, hundreds of Syrian soldiers are deployed to the border on red alert, like something's about to happen. And so that makes Iraq, and will forever make Iraq, a much more complicated dynamic, because there is, the state, which is much more willing and open to accepting the legitimacy of the transitional government in Damascus, and then this kind of wild card PMF Hashd Shabi force, which is not as much. And we saw the effects of that, by the way, when Ahmed al-Shara was supposed to attend the Arab League summit in Baghdad, and it was essentially, at least as I understand, vetoed because of very heavy pressure that the Hashd Shabi put on the foreign minister. Prime Minister Sudani had issued the invitation. The foreign minister got very heavily lobbied, and it ended up being reversed, which was interesting. Lebanon is, the Syrian-Lebanese relationship is just beginning to recover, as we've literally just seen in the last few days with Foreign Minister Shaybani visiting Beirut for the first time. But on the security level, it is still, in my view, a real mess, especially on the border security side of things. The Saudis very early on tried to mediate border security, military to military arrangements and deals. They actually did sign an agreement, although it basically came to nothing several days later when General Aoun, as the president, issued an order to Lebanese armed forces to fire on any Syrian soldier that fired towards the Lebanese border. And he issued that order as there were clashes on the border between a drug smuggling gang and Syrian military forces. And that really put a very sour pill in that relationship. That when you are seen to be, from a Syrian perspective, defending yourself against a security threat, and the response from the sovereign government on the other side is, my military needs to fire on you for intercepting drug smugglers, you're in a pretty problematic place. So it's taken 5 or 6 months to get past that. But all of that was probably more of a diversion from your original question, which is really to answer it by saying all of the borders are important, and all border security on all sides will contribute towards stability. But whilst there isn't as much of a direct border, the one that matters the most is Israel. I mean, that's the one that every business, corporate entity that I have spoken to on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, the one security question they ask constantly is Israel. Is Israel about to overthrow the government? Is Israel going to bomb the presidential palace? Is Israel ever going to make a deal? That's the security wild card when it comes not just to border security, but overall security that I think will still determine, very strongly determine, whether or not businesses are interested and see this as a sustainable transition, because that's the one existential military challenge that still is being presented to Damascus. And you see that when you drive around Umayyad Square in the center of the city, and the Ministry of Defense building is rubble. It is a daily reminder in the capital city that Israel is still capable and still willing to do anything it wants to do if it feels the need to send any number of messages. And again, from a business perspective, that's the kind of thing that matters the most.
Excellent. Thank you so much. For those who have questions, please line up. There are 2 mics. And we need to use the mics both for everyone to hear, but also importantly for Ibrahim to be able to hear us.
Want us to line up there?
Yeah, please do line up there. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Keith, I might need to be turned on. Yeah, there you
Can
go.
you hear me now?
Yeah.
Excellent panel. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We have very good.
Sorry, if you all don't mind also introducing yourself.
Sure. My name is Ibrahim Al-Assil. So I'm an entrepreneur and a consultant and good friend of the panelists as well. So to Charles, what do you think would it take to see the transitional government, Ministry of Defense, on the defense budget in the US, like we see SDF, or like we see Jay Surah in the term, and basically start this counter-terrorism relation, funding, training equipment, something like that, because that's for me will solve a lot of problems, including the Israeli questions. And for Karam, what do you want to see from the government? What do you want to see from, let's say, international community in terms to counter, as you said, the hangover or the fatigue, to kind of counter the risk aversion, to encourage people to invest? Because I agree with you, it seems like probably more than not that we'll see a clear appeal, hopefully in the House before the end of the year, or just like will be signed, hopefully. And to Ibrahim, power sharing. What would it take? And that's probably the hardest question, so that's why I'm going to leave it to you. What would it take to convince, if ever, that for Shara and Shebani to look inward versus just like the good messages outward, to say, how do we reconcile with our communities? Do we need to do power sharing, or do we need to just like lip services and just minor things? So, or do you think there's something that can make them believe that there is a need to do a power sharing for their own survival? So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We go
Yeah,
in that
yeah,
order.
please.
Great questions. I'd love to answer all of them, but I'll just tackle mine. If I understood your question right, you basically are saying, when will we see the MOD being more of a kind of cohesive, professional, legitimate entity? Is that what you meant? It's going to take some time. The MOD in Syria was always going to be a really tough nail to crack in terms of what we call a DDR process, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And we saw very early on, the transitional government giving people the option to drop their arms or keep them and enlist, which, on an obvious level was the right thing to do, but that process is very, very complicated. And by a very imperfect design, we still have a very broad spectrum of different actors who at first were allowed to return to their areas of origin to command their forces, which was not a good first step and led to lots of very negative security consequences. Some of them have since been moved around into different places, but the big problematic aspect I still have in my mind is that Turkey still retains significant lines of influence with part of the Ministry of Defense, who happen to still be mostly based in Aleppo, and then channeling a little bit further down towards Hama and parts of northern Homs. And although the new military accord that Turkey signed with Damascus should, in theory, change that equation, and now Turkish support to train and equip and organize and provide academic instruction or support through the academies should now all be to all Syrian divisions all across the country. It's still an open secret that there are much closer relationships with certain units, and that's forever going to be an obstacle to the kind of picture you're painting. It isn't a coincidence that no other government anywhere in the world has yet provided or sought to provide assistance to the Ministry of Defense. And it is mostly because Turkey is seen as the actor with the inherent advantage in the defense ministry. I mean, the irony is the relationship with Murhaf Abu Kasra as Minister of Defense is not quite so slick and easy by any means. But institutionally, they're still seen as having that advantage that's impossible to compete with. And to divert an answer to your question would be to say it also isn't a coincidence that we have seen much more interest from other governments in the Interior Ministry. So when we look at counterterrorism, because you raised that as the key example of, I guess, trying to build confidence in the international community that this is a government that will dedicate resources to fighting the kind of things we worry about from a security perspective. That's the Interior Ministry. MOD has played essentially no role in counterterrorism since December the 8th. The Ministry of Interior has, through its counterterrorism force, joined hands with American special forces on at least 4 occasions since July in counterterrorism raids against ISIS. That's the Interior Ministry, not the MOD. The Qataris and the Saudis are the prime financiers of the MOI, but there has been very deep institutional contact between, to be blunt, the US intelligence community, direct face-to-face contact almost every week with the Interior Ministry on counterterrorism. Same with the Europeans and same with the regional states. So that's the entity really that is beginning to more emerge in the way that you're describing that we would want the Ministry of Defense to be. That's not necessarily the way it should be, but that's the compromise place that has very clearly emerged in the last few months.
Yeah.
So on your question of dealing with sanctions hangover, I would say a lot of what the government can actually do to change that perspective, that perception that many have about Syria as being a heavily sanctioned country has a lot to do with things other than sanctions. And a lot of that also tends to overlap, by the way, with many of the recommendations that I would make to the Syrian government with sanctions being in place. So now, for example, if you look at the NDAA version, it has 2 different amendments that would require reconciliation. So one of the versions, Senator Graham's version, calls for adding 6 conditions basically for a 120-day suspension that can be renewed. One of those requirements is actually inclusive governance, for instance. Accountability for the crimes, the massacres that happened, that the government is implicated in part of them after the downfall of the regime. So many of those recommendations, I think, would still apply to dealing with sanctions hangover, assuming sanctions would be lifted completely. Now, if you focus more on an economic angle, I would say maybe they need to think through a bit more about their overall economic dogma, their own ideology. It's still a little bit unclear because you get different signals from different directions. But in general, their approach is heavily focused on deregulation, on trickle-down economics, on just supporting the very select few, and making sure that they're happy that they can come invest, that everything is working well for them, while not really caring about the vast majority in the country, which is extremely poor. Maybe not caring is too extreme, but I mean, the focus is just given to that top percentile, maybe top 5%. Another would be to just stop focusing too much on loyalty and allegiance and focusing more on competence. You want people who really know how to run an economy. It doesn't matter if they love you or not. It actually requires someone who knows how to run monetary policy. And a lot of that is actually needed because it's based in skill. You need to know how to run monetary policy or fiscal policy for that matter. I wasn't referring to that specifically. I mean, for any other aspect. So just focusing more on skills. And I would say being more inclusive, not just politically, but also in terms of gender, for instance, including females not in a cosmetic way, genuinely incorporating females in policy institutions is actually an important policy response to many of the challenges. They're half of that society. They view policy challenges in a completely different way, or maybe not completely, but quite often in ways that are very different from the way males view them. For example, their tolerance to risk is on average very different from the risk that males would take. So including them is important in making decisions. They're being completely cast aside. The inclusion of Alawites, for instance, unfortunately, other minorities minorities are also struggling, but Alawites are going to be hit the hardest, in my opinion, because they also have no foreign backers, which leaves me with the very last point, and my apologies for the long rant. I think the issue is for other countries that are supporting the minorities, they tend to focus on specific minorities. So for Israel, it's the Druze in Sweden, which can also be viewed as a pawn, it's both. Like they do care about that minority for internal Israeli politics, but also for their own foreign policy. For the Kurds, there's still enough support from the US government. They do not want to be seen as what they did to their allies in South Vietnam or in Afghanistan, for instance, just pulling the plug, throwing your allies under the bus and leaving. It's clearly that's not what they're trying to do here. So the Kurds do enjoy some support. The Alawites, which are the largest minority in the country, are going to have it so bad, and unless the government genuinely cares about the inclusion of minorities, it's going to be quite bad, I think, for investment, for economic activity, for everything.
Thank you, Karam. Ibrahim?
That's a great question, Ubab, about power sharing, and it's something that I try to focus on and understand, because power sharing is a tool, is not an end goal itself. And empirically, if you look at other conflicts around the world, you see that sometimes power sharing, it could actually freeze a conflict and not transform it. Or to transform the transition. If you look at Bosnia, post-Dayton, Lebanon, post-Taif agreement, Iraq, post-2003, they were power-sharing agreements, but they actually froze the conflict, entrenched the elite sectarianism and the elite capture of the state and the wealth. So to be able to assess if a power sharing, even when it happens, if it's actually a healthy one or a way to freeze the conflict and entrench the capture of the state, is to see if they are moving from transactional bargains into more of institutional responsibility, if they're actually sharing the responsibility and not only power, if they are moving also from the elite agreements that sometimes we see on the Syrian news, more into the public trust, and to actually build a better public trust, and to also move from the talks about coexistence into actual co-governance. So when we start seeing that they are talking about service delivery, when we see transparency and rule of law becoming clearer, I think that's a healthier signs of power sharing, compared to just to have sometimes figures who, as Karam was saying, like just to bring somebody and say, we already have that. And finally, I would also say something that to keep an eye on, to see where things are going in Syria, that's freedom of speech. Because today, democracy is not feasible in Syria. There's no infrastructure for that. But freedom of speech is something that's there and needs to be protected. Once we see the space is becoming smaller and smaller in Syria, that would be a very, very concerning signal.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Seema, I think you're next.
My first question, maybe for Charles, what do you think once these sanctions are removed? What do you think in the short and the medium term would be kind of the red lines that if the Sharia government crosses would trigger another series of sanctions? And yeah, so you can list a couple of or two or three. And another question maybe for Ibrahim. The Syrian diaspora in the US played a very positive role into lobbying for the removal of the sanctions. How do you see this role transforming after the sanctions are removed in the coming period? And then for Karam, I have a question. So as you said, one of you said, the president always mentions development, economy, sustainability, and he wants to liberalize the economy. In this country where 90% are in the poverty line, and in a society that has been relying heavily on subsidies from the government, how do you think that would play if it comes very fast?
Another good set of questions. Red lines. Well, I mean, I think first of all, to mention to your question, this was the key part of the debate around the Caesar Act, which, you know, half of which was closed out last week, but the debate around the two different versions of legislation as to whether or not there would be an immediate snapback of the Caesar Act, depending on those 6 conditions, or whether or not we will have a full repeal of the Caesar Act. And then the government still has the capacity or the ability to revise it, but there isn't a snapback. That's really, really key for the way that investors look at Syria. And if we went with Lindsey Graham's text and 180-day snapback was in place, no investors are going to touch Syria. It's never going to happen. And it's a really, really key part of the debate. This issue of 6 conditions, I mean, I guess a bunch of us have seen is it public? The list? Right. So there's a longer list. That isn't public, that is, I think, maybe about to be sent to Damascus to convey a longer set of expectations that aren't conditions for sanctions repealing. But it's basically Democrats and Republicans on one side of the debate registering that they do have expectations, even if they want a full repeal. The problem with a lot of them that I saw on this very, very long list is most of them to be accomplished are going to take years. And, you know, Ibrahim made the point that Syria, infrastructure-wise, is just not in a place to have a democracy right now, which, frankly, is part of the government's argument around having a very imperfect electoral process recently, which is it's just impossible to have something that would be in any way equated to a fully legitimate, transparent, democratic election. But without going into detail on that list, that many of them will take 3 to 5 years to accomplish. And yet, if our politicians, as an American, despite my accent, if our politicians are registering that as an expectation within 6 or 12 months, we're setting ourselves up to be deeply disappointed, and not necessarily for a lack of action or a desire by the transitional government to accomplish them. But the red lines, I think, and to be very, very blunt about it, I think with this Trump administration, if Donald Trump is making the decision, his priority right now is that Syria stabilizes no matter what, and then has some of those positive knock-on effects that have been described, Syria being a hub for interconnectivity, prosperity, exchange across the region in a way that Syria has never been able to be for the rest of the region. And for that reason, Trump has very few red lines, as we've seen. You know, all of the conditions that were originally put in place by his deputies were swiftly deleted the moment he shook hands with Ahmed al-Shara and said sanctions were going to be ceased. So I think there's really only one, which would be if we saw another big Sweda-like incident where 1,000 civilians are killed in a complete chaos of internecine violence. And that's a real danger that is on the government's mind right now, and not from the perspective that they think they're about to do that, but just for people's interests. One quick side note, the tribes in Sweda took law into their own hands. If anyone familiar with what happened in Sweda, when government forces pulled out, the tribes continued to commit atrocities on the ground. And the Syrian Tribal Confederation, in the government's perspective, figured out around Sweda that they have a lot more power to determine what happens in Syria than they believed they had before the incident in Sweda. And there is really significant concern in the real high powers in Damascus now that they cannot fully control the tribes. So it's not a coincidence, and this is really going into the weeds, that Abu Ahmad Zakur, someone who Ahmad al-Shara fell out with famously a few years ago because he was engaging too closely with Free Syrian Army groups in Aleppo, has suddenly been appointed the president's special envoy to the tribes. It's not a coincidence that we are now seeing governors all across the country bringing all the tribal leaders into their offices for talks. The government is in a kind of emergency mode now to bring the tribes back on board to ensure that another Sweda doesn't happen. Or even more dangerously, that it doesn't happen in the SDF-held areas, which is a really, really potent danger right now, especially in Deir ez-Zor, where we've seen hundreds of tribesmen being arrested by the SDF in recent weeks for having Ahmad al-Shara's picture on their cell phone, for having visited Damascus for health treatment and then returning. They're arrested on return. There have been about 500 arrests in the last 6 weeks like that, and it has set the tribes aflame. And so, again, sorry, that was a bit of a diversion, but that's the real danger, that we see a return to total chaos that the government cannot control. And then we have, lots of red lights blinking in foreign capitals.
Can I actually take my privilege as a moderator to ask a finer point on what you were just saying, which is, if the Lindsey Graham version of the bill passes, for example, or even a watered down version of that has all of these conditions that are actually impossible to meet, does that mean that actually the sanctions have been lifted? That's on, if it passes, but there are all these conditions, in actuality, especially from an investor's point of view, does that mean that the sanctions are actually gone? That's one thing. And then the other thing is, if Senator Graham is putting these forward, and you also ended your comments in the questions that I was asking, saying that the number one question on this side of the Atlantic is Israel, and what does Israel want or not want in Syria? Graham being very famously sort of on the pro-Israel side, can one kind of presume from these kinds of comments and this political reality in Congress that even if the other version passes that is not Senator Graham's, but that there's all of this conversation happening similar in some ways to the JCPOA with Iran on the pro-Israel side, which was telling investors, hey, don't take the sanctions relief very seriously. The next president that comes, we're going to push back the other way, so don't even invest. Can you foresee something like that kind of taking place here?
It's a great couple of questions. In large part, no. The latter part of your question, I can't see necessarily happening, because the vast majority of Democrats are on side with the idea of giving Syria a chance. Of course, unless something like what I just described happened, then we'd be having a different conversation. But hopefully, assuming it doesn't, and the traditional people we would normally worry about with, the idea of giving Ahmad al-Shara a chance would have been Trump and his immediate circle. And yet what we've seen is the moment Donald Trump decided that he liked this guy, everybody else rallied around the flag and started tweeting out, "Make Syria great again." So the exception to this rule, quite interestingly, is Lindsey Graham as the biggest voice here. And I don't want to get into lots of conspiracy theories, but you raised Israel, and it's quite well known that Israel has had a role in lobbying for the idea that strict conditions should be put on this particular measure, whilst at least Israel hasn't yet signed a security accord with Syria. And that's the wild card here, is if we do get an Israel-Syria security accord that then adds confidence in that relationship, I think we'll see a lot less pressure on the Hill to start really keeping these, if they are in place, really keeping these conditions very, very strictly monitored. Because again, not to be too cold about it, I think the wider calculation here is, I guess to an extent, what I said earlier, which is Syria is going to be chaotic and it is still going to be violent for a quite long period of time. But the calculation is that if in 5 or 10 years it can be this place that ties the rest of the Middle East together and isn't an exporter of terrorism or drugs or blackmailing regional states, everything changes. And that's the core priority. So if, again, to put it in a very horrible, cold way, if 1,000 people die, we have problems. If 100 people die, we probably won't. And that is the way that it is being looked at, quite frankly. Nobody pays attention when 40 people are killed every week, but they really pay attention when 1,000 people are. And that's the place that we're in at the moment. And as long as that remains the case, I don't think we'll have that list of conditions ultimately, as Karam was saying.
Thank you. Go ahead, Karim.
So the question for me was, I think, around economic policy and the way the government is running those policies. I would just say first, while there is clear preference and like tendency to move towards extremely capitalistic economic like standards, this is not finalized yet. You know, it's not a done deal. And until now, you see these three key ingredients still interacting with each other. You know, you have the political leadership that has its own views on how the economy should be run. Then you have the experts and international organizations that are also advising on the matter. They have the skill set to actually talk about these things, but they do not have as much political power. And then you have the bureaucracy, which might be, in terms of numbers, maybe 95% of the machinery of government, but they are the weaker part in terms of political influence. But you do still see all of these three ingredients interacting and producing completely different results in each ministry, which has produced very disjointed economic policies, you know, so because obviously it also depends on not only the macro position of the political leadership, but also on the charisma of the appointed minister, for instance, you know, in deciding how much influence he gets to have in his own ministry. And so each ministry now or the central bank are moving in, I would say, completely different directions. You know, some do believe in protectionist policies, some do believe in taxing broad base, some believe not really, you know, just focus on very, very few, and that's what matters. The implications would be quite serious, you know, because it depends on what your ultimate outcome is. You know, if you are the political leader and your ultimate goal is to stay in power, as they call it, like the number one rule in politics, you know, you just political survivorship is your number one priority, then I would opt for the version that is being pushed by the political leadership, because if you just have a very select elite that you need to ensure they're happy, selectorate, it's much easier for you to run the country, because then the majority will just have no say. And as long as they're not taxed, as the plans currently are, they would have far less say in how the country is being run. And whether they like it or they don't, it doesn't really affect state revenues. You know, you can be angry from now until eternity. You know, if you don't pay me taxes and you don't pose a security threat to me in the way I'm running the country, then you can be sad all you want. So, but that's not, again, the position that is necessarily going to be implemented throughout the country. I think that is quite simply yet to be seen. The government is now working on like a whole of government approach to, now they're focusing more on mapping the needs for the country so they can funnel foreign aid in a better way. Foreign support maybe is a better word. But I think from that, you will also see some clearer ideas around their economic dogma.
Ibrahim, go ahead.
The question for me by Seema was on the role of the Syrian American community, and the role of the community has changed so much over the last 9 months, probably one of the deepest and largest changes in the history of the Syrian American community, because over the last 15 years, the community was organized and structured based on the binary and the position towards Assad and the uprising. And today that's gone. So there is a lot of changes, structural changes happening now. Some people who were active are not active anymore. Many of those who were not active, they are now active. And I think briefly, I think 2 points that the community could prioritize at this point, and it's a very, very active and generous community with all its resources and capabilities. I think the first one, to create in the community a reflection or maybe an image of the society that they want to see in Syria. I think the Syrian American community needs a national dialogue. They need to actually sit together and talk about their differences, the same way that they hope that would happen in Syria. And then the second point which is to bring the two nations together. Sometimes that was not possible before. This is a great chance for Syria and the United States to be closer as the two nations. And I don't mean only government and Congress, but the people, the businesses, the academia, the artists, the entrepreneurs, to create different channels. And there are already many initiatives now. There's like the Syrian American Business Council, which is something that we could have never probably thought about before. But I think increasing those initiatives and not only focusing on Congress and the White House is something very, very important and promising for the future of Syria.
Thank you. We'll take one last question.
2 questions, please. Amir Salman, thank you all for being here today. Ibrahim, I won't ask you anything because every time I see him, I ask him a lot of questions, so I will spare him today. First one is for Mr. Kalo. I know right now foreign direct investment is a very important thing for Syria. So just based on your conversations there, as you know, FDI needs strong laws and strong policies. So are you talking with the different actors there about what these different FDI-centric laws are? And I know, for example, France has Choose France, the US has Select USA, different programs focused on FDI promotion. Could we see something like that in Syria soon, or is it too early? And then my second question is for Charles. I know we touched on this a bit earlier, but we are at Johns Hopkins. There are a lot of students and there are a lot of professors, and a lot of people get their news from social media, and a lot of people get their misinformation from social media. And I've seen professors affiliated with this university repost misinformation on Syria. So based on that, can you just give a quick 2-minute explainer on the misinformation that a lot of people are getting on Syria today? Thank you.
I've seen some governorates trying to have their own promotional programs for investing in their governorate, like in Aleppo, for instance. But I'm yet to see something nationwide, that the whole of government is lobbying behind. What I would say is, after the downfall of the regime, you had this proliferation of new bodies, that people do not necessarily understand. You have the sovereign fund, for example. You have the new investment authority that is shaken up and reconfigured. You have the development fund and like another third body. And these different organizations, I think, are meant to help the government deal with the fact that the rest of government is in paralysis. It's a very dysfunctional government. So you go and create these parallel structures that are much more agile. They do respond to you quite quickly. You appoint capable people in them so they can run them. But that's also creating a lot of confusion. So what I would also say is, if the government is trying to attract foreign investment and they are trying so hard, it's one of the areas where the government, I would say, has done incredibly well, in terms of sending good messages to the business community. And I would say also in foreign diplomacy, they've done spectacularly well. In investment, I would say maybe it's much less about branding and coming up with a program called Invest in Syria, or we come and explain it to you and so on. These things do help, but what matters is really the entirety of that infrastructure. So, for example, you can create as many programs as you like, but if the security situation is fragile, as Charles was saying, no one is going to come, really. If the political outlook for the country is not clear, no one is going to come. If it continues to be fragmented in the way it is at the moment, where the government doesn't control maybe a third of the country, or like in terms of population, maybe closer to 20%, no one really is going to come. And those challenges need a lot of time. We need to wait a little bit, because 1 year is just way too short for a country like Syria to start to have positive impacts on investment, hoping, even if everything was going incredibly well. And unfortunately, that's not the case.
And on this information, it's hard to put it down to 2 minutes, but in every society relies on accurate information to remain stable, informed. To know why you want to get up in the morning and go to work the next day, you need to know what's happening in your world, in your immediate world. Syria has always had, obviously for decades, it had state media that very much only told one side of the story. During the revolution, you had revolutionary opposition media that also pretty much only told one side of the story, with some good exceptions. But it was a binary situation in which you had two very different narratives. When I first went into Syria after Assad fell in February, to give you an example, I was in Latakia and Tartus for a few days, and everyone I spoke to said, my only source of information is Facebook. And one woman said, my only source of information is Facebook. I know that 90% of it is fake. But because it's my only source of information, it is my only source of information, and so I go with it. And yes, you know, in Damascus, they have relaunched Sana, they've rebranded Al-Ikhbariya, we have more media, but on the local level, people still rely on Facebook for their local news. And that's where you've seen the disinformation proliferate in just an unbelievable scale. And you know, every day brings multiple new examples. Today there was a big fuss around, you know, a big post that went viral saying that a street name had been changed from something that was Alawite to something that was Sunni, completely made up, just a made-up photograph with someone who had used, you know, whatever, I forget what it's called now, you know, the image software to change it, Photoshop. But throughout big bouts of violence, we see this spike, you know, with every village suddenly announcing the General Security Service is raiding our village and we're all on lockdown, and there's no one to be seen. There's nothing even happening. And so every minute, every hour, there is this fake news coming in, and it's all directed at dividing society. And so, you know, you need only guess where it all comes from. But the real worry is when it then drives violence. And that's what we have seen, sadly. We saw it in the coast when the violence first started out. There was a huge explosion of fake news on both sides that unquestionably drove people to the battlefield, so to speak, and to the chaos and to all of the atrocities that happened. And we saw it on a far greater scale in Sweden in July. And as you point out, when we have government officials, not just in the US, but you know, all across the region, and Israel, frankly speaking, is very, very bad at this. There are Israeli ministers who continue to tweet a picture of what they say are division-level commanders in the Ministry of Defense, all of whom are crazy ISIS people from years and years and years ago, who were all killed. And yet, that goes viral every single day in Israel, and it's driving the popular opinion around what Syria represents, because people who know nothing about Syria will believe what their ministers tell them. So it's a huge problem. There's no easy solution. That's the unfortunate thing. It's very easy to sow disinformation and almost impossible to stop it. And so it's a challenge that the government is going to have to face. And I'll just conclude by saying, you know, one of the big narratives that continues to be sold outside of Syria around the security situation in Syria is that the coast remains deeply unstable. Well, I obsessively follow every single violent incident in Syria on a daily basis and cover it in my Substack, so I have all the data to show this. The coast of Syria right now is the most stable region in all of Syria. And we could get into a whole conversation as to why, because the Interior Ministry has plowed a huge amount of resources into local relationships, and it has recruited locally into the internal public security force. But the narrative that the coast is the most violent place in all of Syria drives the creation of conditions around the Caesar Act, saying, well, Alawites are still being massacred in dozens and dozens every week. Whereas, yeah, it's not that it's not happening, but now it is genuinely about one a week. Whereas 6 months ago, it was 15 to 20. And for 1 week, it was 1,000. So things change, but there are very few people, there are very few of us who are paying as finite detail to know what the truth is. But I bet you if you ask people on the coast how secure they felt, most of their narratives, most of their understanding would be it is still immensely dangerous. And most of that will be because they are still depending on social media as their source of information, which is this impossible square to circle.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's happening everywhere. That's impossible to circle. Please join me in thanking this really incredible panel. I learned so much from all three of you, and I really thank you all for being here, and Ibrahim for joining us, even though your flight had all of those issues. Thank you to Kedem for traveling all the way from New Zealand to be with us tonight.
and Charles from down the road, but still on a rainy October. So thank you all for being here. We hope to see you again soon.